So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's lecture of the Society for Libyan Studies. Now, just some information before we start. The talk will be recorded and it will then become available via the Society website for those who would like to watch it. And after the presentation, there will be time for questions. If you have any questions, please type your questions in the Q&A box that you should find at the bottom of your screen. Do not use the chat. Please use the Q&A. And so we are ready to start. It is a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker, Maria Carmela Gatto, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Mediterranean and Oriental Cultures of the Polish Academy of Sciences and an honorary research fellow at the School of Archaeology and Ancient History of the University of Leicester. She is the principal investigator of the Borderscape project, which was funded by the National Science Center of Poland. This collaborative project looks at Egyptian state formation and the changing socio-spatial landscape of the first Nile cataract region in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. Alongside this research, Maria is continuing her previous work as the co-director of the Aswan Komombo archaeological project in Egypt. For many years, she has contributed to the investigation of Garamantian culture in the Libyan Sahara, first as a member of the Italian mission of the Sapienza University of Rome in southwestern Fezzan, and then as a research associate for the Trans-Sahara project at the University of Leicester, which was funded by the European Research Council and was directed by David Mattingly. Maria has published extensively on a range of topics related to their research. Of particular relevance to tonight's lecture are the volume Burials, Migration and Identity in the Ancient Sahara and Beyond, which she co-edited with David Mattingly, Nick Ray, and Martin Sturry. It was published by the Society for Libyan Studies and Cambridge University Press in 2019, as well as her contribution to the volume Mobile Technologies in the Ancient Sahara and Beyond, which appeared in the same series in 2020. Our lecture tonight will look at Garamantian pottery, change and exchange in an interregional perspective. So without further ado, Maria, the digital floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Niccolo, for the kind introduction. I hope you can see my screen. Okay. So thank you very much to the Society for Libyan Studies for inviting me to present this evening, and thank you to you all for joining us today. As Niccolo already mentioned, I'm going to talk about the Garamantes of the Libyan Sahara, a topic most of you are well acquainted with because of the outstanding work by Professor David Mattingly. I will focus on an aspect less known of the Garamantian material culture, the handmade pottery. I will consider the ceramic evidence from both the Wadi al-Ajal, the heartland of the Garamantes, where the University of Leicester has worked extensively since the late 1990s, and the Wadi Tanzzuft, where Sapienza University of Rome worked in the same period. My analysis, which has been published, as Niccolo was mentioning, in the 4th volume of the Trans-Saharan series dedicated to the mobile technologies, considers technological traits of the Garamantian pottery through a time span including the 1st millennium BC and AD. The handmade pottery represents the bulk of the ceramic material recovered in Garamantian context and is the only locally produced pottery. I will discuss with you chronological and spatial variations within Garamantian ceramics, as well as comparisons with previous and contemporary ceramic productions from the same region and elsewhere across the Greater Sahara. This approach will give us hints into the timing and directionality of technological change and exchange and their social meaning. This overview relies heavily on the results of a workshop on sub-Saharan and Saharan handmade pottery organized in 2015 in Leicester in conjunction with the Trans-Saharan Project Mobile Technologies Conference. And I want to thank here all the colleagues who attended the workshop for their invaluable contribution. Before getting down to business, let's refresh our memory on the Garamantes. The archaeological research undertaken by the British and Italian teams has completely changed traditional understanding of the Garamantes society based on classical sources, which saw the Garamantes as a stereotype of desert nomads and uncivilized people suited to harshest of environments. We now know that they developed into a polity with a hierarchical system, urban centers, so a massive demographic expansion, adopted a written script, developed agriculture, related technologies for water management, and large-scale manufacturing. Introduced into the desert the horse, the camel, and wheeled transport, and established political and trade and political relations that extended across the Sahara and beyond. They may have been desert nomads, but they definitely were not uncivilized. The British and Italian teams are the first to have produced systematic publications on Garamantian pottery, yet they approach the study from different research agendas. The British team consisted of Roman pottery specialists, the late John Dora and Anna Leone, concentrated their efforts upon constructing a full-scale pottery type series, including both local productions and imported wares, covering a long chronological span, not confined only to the Garamantian period. The Italian team instead produced a systematic analytical classification, which I was responsible for, of only the handmade pottery from sites dated to the Garamantian period, leaving aside the relatively limited Roman imports recovered in the Tanzzuft region, which were studied separately. Being a specialist of prehistoric pottery from Northeastern Africa, my approach in studying the Garamantian pottery focused not only on the description of manufacturing processes, the so-called chaîne opératoire, but gave particular attention to the analysis of decorative technologies and tools, following a classification developed by Isabella Caneva and used widely in Africa. The latter has been essential in identifying for the first time in the Central Sahara the use since the early first millennium BC of cord-twisted roulette implements to obtain simple or rolled impressions on vessels, as well as an important shift towards a production of painted wares in the first millennium AD. These two changes have an impact on a broader scale. In fact, both elements are outliers in terms of the previous Central Saharan ceramic tradition. The roulette technique is a sub-Saharan phenomenon, while painted wares, with the kind of decoration encountered from the late first millennium AD in Fezzan, have similarities with Berber wares of Mediterranean Africa. Let's start reviewing the technological features of the Garamantian pottery. And let's start with raw material and procurement and processing. Clay sources have been identified in both the Wadi al-Ajal and the Wadi Tanzzuft as locally or regionally derived, with that used to produce pottery in the Wadi Tanzzuft being only local, while those used in the capital Germa or found in pottery from the capital Germa and in the Wadi al-Ajal that came from different locations but within the region, which could also mean that some of the vessels were imported. At a macro analysis level, the fabrics usually appear as a mix of sand, crushed minerals, white inclusions, organic inclusions, and grog, crushed potsherds. The interpretation given to this mix is that of the inclusions were naturally present in the clay, being intentionally added only in the coarser variants. Of course, this is not the case of the grog that was definitely added. It is important to note that this is the first time, the first occurrence known in the Libyan Sahara of grog as tempering agent. The most frequent recorded shaping techniques, often complementary to one another, are pinching, molding, and coiling. The practice of molding the vessel by pinching the lump of clay is clearly indicated in most of the body shards and was probably used mainly to build up bodies. On the other hand, the use of coiling seems to be more closely associated with the shaping of shoulders, necks, and rims of jars, pointing to the combination of different techniques in the same vessel. Unfortunately, not systematic observation of traces left by forming procedures was generated by either group, either archaeological team, effectively preventing, for the time being, a full comprehension of fashioning modes and operational sequences. Filling this gap is a priority for future investigation. Recorded form includes bowls and jars. Most of the recorded shapes are globular, wide-mouthed, everted rim jars with a restricted, colored, inflected contour. Bowls instead count for less than 20% in each assemblage. Some of the shapes found in the Wadi al-Ajal are unknown in the Tanzzuft. Others, such as platters and doll pots, as well as incense burners, are time sensitive and not present everywhere. Outer surfaces are mostly smoothed with spatula or with fibers. Slipping and burnishing as techniques of shaping the surface treatments are very rare. Most of the inner surfaces are left rough, with all the pinching impression clearly visible. Surface colors are usually patched due to non-uniform firing. The great majority of the Garamantian pottery is actually undecorated. In the Wadi Tanzzuft sites, it represents 90% of the total handmade pottery. It is difficult to say for Germa because the number of decorated shards is not specifically reported in the publications. The typical Garamantian decoration is obtained by impressing a twisted cord on the surface when still partially wet, using the roulette or the simple impression techniques. Different patterns are reported and they appear to be time sensitive. At Germa, again, it's difficult to count how many shards with roulette decorations were recovered because they are not divided from the rest of the handmade pottery, only painted wares were divided. And because the use of impressions is not always clearly stated, but it seems that the percentage may be lower than in the assemblages from the Tanzzuft. Incisions are almost exclusively used to create geometric patterns restricted to the upper part of the vessels. And they are significantly less frequent than roulette impressions, and they are generally applied to jars. Applications such as circular, pyramidal, or flat knobs are mainly applied to the vessel shoulders as the only decoration or as part of composite patterns. A single example of a kind of wavy snake from the citadel of Agramnadarif in the Tanzzuft and the snake applied to a jar found in a campsite at the outskirts of the oasis of Fewet, again in the Tanzzuft, are the only examples of the sort. Few examples of applications are present at Germa, and there is a kind of long, thick application that you can see here to the top right of the slide, that has been identified as an handle, but which may have also been used as with a decorative function, let's say. So that's not clear, but it's a possibility. Fragments of vessels, of painted vessels, are generally found in limited numbers in the Tanzzuft region, and are dated to the later phases of the Garamantian culture, broadly the first half of the first millennium AD. They present reasonable simple patterns formed by vertical red or white lines applied in alternation or in combination. A rare red and white cross-hatched pattern was found in Agramnadarif to the left of the slide, the only rim shirts available thus far are from colored pots. An example to an exception to this is the case of the incense burners, commonly found at Germa and in the graves of the Wadi al-Ajal, with only one example found at Agram Nadarif. The situation is rather different in the Wadi al-Ajal, where painted pottery is relatively common in the Germa sequence from the classical Garamantian period up to medieval times. The earliest example is dated to around the beginning of the 1st century AD, slightly earlier than in the Tanzzuft. For most of the Garamantian period, cross-edge patterns, simple lines, dots, or simple geometric patterns are the most common painted decorations, changing into more Berberesque painted patterns only after the Garamantian period. As in the Tanzzuft, there is evidence of combined decorations. The colored globular jars is the most common form of painted vessels, also at Germa. However, there is a larger variability as far as the shaping concerned at the capital and in the Wadi al-Ajal, including some which are not found in the Tanzzuft. There are also many examples of composite patterns obtained by using different techniques simultaneously. As a final note, no remains of kilns have been found in Fezzan, which may indicate that temporary structures, open fires, could have been used as kiln to produce pottery. There is no evidence of specialization in ceramic manufacturing, which fits the model of what van der Leeuw called a household production. Now that we have a better understanding of what the Garamantian handmade pottery is about, and we already hinted at some chronological and spatial variations, let's focus on those latter aspects, starting with the pottery from the earliest phase, which is still not well known. Here I have written down the different phases of the Garamantian period, so the Garamantian culture, and the places, the sites from where the pottery is has been collected. So the pottery that I have been used for this study. At the hill fort town of Zinkegra, the pottery recovered, quite limited in number, shows for these early periods, shows decorations obtained by a comb applied using both simple and rocker stamp impressions techniques, reminiscent of the previous pastoral tradition. The earliest example of roulette decoration, at least from what we can gather from the publication of Charles Daniels and the Fezzan project, is dated to the early 1st millennium BC. A systematic reanalysis of the pottery from Daniels' excavation, now housed at the Libyan Society Archive at Leicester University, would be essential to confirm and expand upon this assertion. A campsite located in the western fringes of Gatto oasis provides further material evidence for this transitional moment. The typical recorded form is a globular ball with a thick rim band modeled on the exterior, like that we have just seen from Zinkegra. Simple impressed, plain or dotted herringbone patterns obtained using a comb or a spatula and incised crisscross patterns decorate the rim band. Rocker dotted zigzags made with a comb and roulette or simple impressions made with a twisted cord, forming packed or herringbone patterns, were applied to the bodies. Simple and rocker impressions, as well as incisions, are reminiscent of the pastoral decorative tradition. The site has not been securely dated, but it might well be an early example of the arrival of this new decorative technique and tool, the roulette. Similar pottery has been found not only at Zinkegra, as we have seen, but also in campsites from the Ubari Sand Sea, north of the Wadi al-Ajal, and all tentatively dated to the late pastoral, final pastoral period, which means the end of the 2nd millennium, beginning of the early millennium BC. Outside of Fezzan, Similar vessel shapes are reported from the Adarbus and the Gobero area in Niger, with rare examples of roulette technique and implement also described. Both assemblages are dated to the late Ternarian, roughly contemporary to the final pastoral phase in Fezzan, with which it shares many cultural traits. A vessel with a similar shape, rim decoration, and a roulette decoration is reported online to be part of the Henri Lot's collection of objects from the Tassili Massif in Algeria, now, and this is now in Paris. It has all the potential to be another of these transitional early Garamantian ceramic examples, which would include, unsurprisingly, the Tassili as part of this Central Saharan network. So we can see that there are elements of continuity and gradual variation between the pastoral and the Garamantian ceramic manufacturing processes in the Fezzan. They are mainly detectable in the shaping technology, with coiling always in use, and a high degree of consistency over time in the vessel form produced. From the pastoral to the Garamantian traditions, there are a continual, gradual, and apparently interrupted move towards undecorated productions, with early and middle pastoral vessels always completely decorated, while late and final pastoral vessels mostly displaying zonal decorations confined to the rim band or anyway to the upper part of the body, and Garamantian productions being predominantly undecorated. But there are also sudden changes, so discontinuities between the two productions, including the number of vessels found at a given site, being higher in Garamantian than in pastoral times, the use of grog as temper, and roulette tool and technique, and later painting for decoration. Consistency and continuity are also visible within the manufacturing process of the Garamantian period, with major chronological and spatial variations detected only for roulette and painted decorations and for some vessel shapes. But we must check, of course, more deeply the shaping technologies that, as I already said, are not well studied so far. So this may be another point of discontinuity. It is interesting to note that wheel-thrown technology, well known in Mediterranean Africa, was never adopted by local potters, and Punic or Roman vessels, although used by the Garamantes, so they were well known, were never copied locally. So what distinguished the Garamantian manufacturing process for now are four elements: the use of grog as temper, the drawing out a lamp as shaping technique, the roulette as technology and tool, and the painted cross-hatching as decorative pattern. Roulette and grog characterized the Garamantian ceramic technology from its inception at the beginning of the first millennium BC. Painted instead, as we said, is a later addition from the beginning of the first millennium AD. The shaping technique of drawing out a lamp is a very simple technique and offers little information about technological transfer. There are more sophisticated techniques, many of which are well known in sub-Saharan Africa, and future research should investigate if any of those were used already by the Garamantes. Implements that could be used for roulette impressions are varied. The simplest being a twisted cord obtained by rolling fibers together and then knotting their ends. This is the most widespread roulette implement across sub-Saharan Africa nowadays, as it was in the past, and one of the earliest in use. This is actually the only one to have been identified in the Garamantian corpus. The earliest evidence thus far of twisted cord roulette impression is known from the lower Tilemsi Valley in the eastern Mali, where it is dated to the mid-3rd millennium BC. By the mid-2nd millennium BC, roulette decorations were widespread south of the Sahara in West Africa, only spreading eastwards along the Sahelian belt much later. The earliest evidence in Niger, as I already said, is dated to the end of the second millennium BC and parallel the proposed timing for the arrival in the Fezzan. The scarcity of data, particularly from the southern Sahara, from key areas such as the Agar or the Adrar Versiforas in Mali, prevents any further postulation. And because of this, no agreement could be found at the end of the workshop in defining the timing and directionality of technological transfer. Nevertheless, roulette decorations are unknown in other areas of North Africa, including the Nile Valley. And these, along with the proposed chronology, further supports a correspondence with the Western Sahel and for this technological transfer. The use of grog temper is not a common occurrence in the Sahara, Nile Valley, or Mediterranean Africa. Instead, grog is the most common type of inclusion in the Tlemcen pottery of the mid-3rd millennium BC and was commonly used in the Middle Niger ceramic productions from the 2nd millennium BC, arguing once more for this type of connection and this type of technological transfer. The grog may have followed the same trajectory of the roulette, strengthening the idea that they moved to Fezzan and apparently elsewhere too as part of a package. In the Tlemcen, an increase in wares decorated with cord roulette and tempered with chaff and grog is dated to around 2000 BC and is linked to the development of the agriculture in the area. And indeed, the chaff that was used as tempering agent is that of domesticated millet. The Tlemcen data may help us narrow down the time of the technological transfer, or at least, or exchange, let's say, and encounter, or at least provide a starting date for it. If we take into consideration that what arrived in Fezzan are only the grog and the cord roulette, then it may be possible that the encounter happened before 2000 BC, too early for the dates that we have from Fezzan, where we should remember that the evidence currently at our disposal could be that of the farthest extremes of a complex network. So we can see the beginning at the end of this transfer, but we are missing the, let's say, the link in between, so the middle part. Which means that if more data from the central regions, such as the Agar, for instance, would be available, we could have a better understanding of the timing and what happened and where the encounter happened and the transfer happened. Probably not in the Fezzan. Tracking the origin of possible exchange trajectories for painted decorations, particularly the cross-hatched, is more difficult, as they indeed are relatively simple and common patterns which have contemporary and earlier counterparts in many areas of Africa. A south transfer may be suggested again, but would the transfer of a single and quite simple element make sense after a millennium? So in this case, would have been just one element moving north. Alternative avenues of transfer should be taken into consideration, particularly because of the similarities between the post-Garamantian medieval painted patterns in the Wadi al-Ajal and those found in the Berber world. Sorry. In fact, and there is also the fact that chronological and geographical distribution of painted wares in Garamantian and post-Garamantian Fezzan points to a possible northern connection, because we have a different percentage of pottery and also different typology of pottery between the south and the southwestern Fezzan, the Tanzzuft, and the Wadi al-Ajal, the northern part. So there may be scope points to a northern connection, which would fit well with the evolving relations with Punic Roman Africa established by the Garamantes at that time. Painted wares have a long tradition in the Maghreb. For instance, they are already recorded in the early Numidian layers in Al-Tiburos, so in Tunisia. And as you can see, there is already a cross-hatched pattern, painted pattern. Furthermore, we should address the few examples of complex decorations found in the Garamantian corpus, which has similar counterparts in the Middle Niger region, dated around the end of the first millennium BC and the beginning of the first millennium AD, but also in the Borku region of Chad, unfortunately not well dated. So these are contexts that are lacking chronological attribution. The interpretation of these commonalities is rather difficult at the moment because we don't have enough data. This could be just coincidental occurrences of common traits among different schools of knowledge, or they can have, a more in-depth meaning. I must state here that the examples found in each of these contexts, including the Garamantia, are locally made, not imports. I could vision some of these, including the material from Borku and also from Timbuktu, and the fabrics are completely different, so they're clearly locally made. In conclusion, both roulette and grog, as implement, technique, and tempering agent, arrived as a package at the same time and likely from the same source. Painting, instead, needs further investigation before any statement on origin and directionality of transfer can be made. Unfortunately, the state of research on painting wares and more generally handmade wares in Mediterranean Africa is very limited, hampering further analysis for the time being. A new avenue of investigation should be devoted to the subject and would highly improve the chances of understanding interregional interaction and technological transfer between the Sahara and the northern region from an African perspective this time, so not from the Mediterranean Punic Roman perspective. A further element to be considered is the great percentage of undecorated vessels in the Garamantian corpus, which has no parallel in the heavily decorated sub-Saharan assemblages, another feature that the Garamantes ceramic production may share with northern regions. Despite the huge biases observed in the data, there is no doubt that technological transfer occur somehow and somewhere. But how that would have happened? A pivotal point is that the use of both grog as temper and roulette as implement and technique mean that the potters of the early Garamantian communities made choices that went far beyond the mere copying of something they saw somewhere. So it's not that they just saw a pot decorated with roulette and you can replicate that with the same technique. Or for the use of grog, you just understand that that's a crushed pot sherd and you do it for your pot. Tempering agents used by potters can vary greatly for different reasons, including availability of raw materials, functionality of the pot produced, traditions and taboos. In the Sahara, naturally available organic and mineral tempers, such as plants, sand, or coarse minerals, have always been used. The technical properties provided by grog inclusions in the paste could have been easily derived by any other available agent, as in fact was before the Garamantes. The choice to temper pottery with grog was thus intentional and likely influenced by cultural factors. The clay preparation stage in pottery production was usually an activity performed in the potter's workshop. An emulation by knowledgeable craft people who happened to be around could have been a mechanism of knowledge transfer. A discussion between potters, perhaps in a marketplace, on what kind of tempering agents they were using, could have been another way of knowledge transfer. Indeed, It is not difficult to understand how to crash a sherd and use it as a temper, but somebody has to tell you that you can do it. As a third situation, it could have been that new potters arrived into the Fezzan and directly participating in the manufacturing process of this kind of vessels. It would have been highly unlikely for a potter who had never used grog or didn't know of its existence to notice it inside a pot and decide to use it instead of his or her own usual temper. As the roulette, we must rule out the possibility that the transfer happened because pots from the south reached the Fezzan as imports of some kind. In fact, if a potter wanted to replicate a roulette decoration without having any previous knowledge of the tool and the technique, that would have been quite difficult. And he would have used his own tool and techniques. We have two possible scenarios here to consider. The first is that the potter has some way to discuss with other potter how to decorate, the decoration was made. And that could have happened like for the grog in a marketplace. For the twisted cord roulette, the only one known in Fezzan and the easiest to make, that discussion could have been enough for the knowledge to be transferred. Alternatively, the potter could have been trained by potters from a different school, learning firsthand how to make the tool and apply the technology to produce it, to produce for his decoration. Then again, new potters could have been moved into Fezzan. Those transitional vessels we have previously discussed, which have shapes and rim top decoration reminiscent of those of the pastoral period, could have been made by newcomers without problems. In fact, both globular shapes and decorations made by incisions and simple impressions are easy to emulate, and an incoming potter would have been willing to make them if there was a local demand. This kind of encounter is better defined as the arrival of another learning network, which doesn't necessarily imply different identities. Divergences and continuities with both local and southern traditions would support the arrival in Fezzan of potters from a different learning network. So that's what we came up with as a result for our workshop in 2015. So there is a great possibility that somebody moved north, potters, of course. Giving an identity to those potters, however, is a difficult task. Liverani and Mattingly has suggested that the new agents were slaves. Discussion among the workshop attendees, however, has ruled this as highly unlikely, because as Olivier Gosselin pointed out, there is usually no possibility for slaves to maintain their own traditions, for instance, in making pottery. My opinion is that those potters could have been either females entering the Garamantian societies through marriages or through being part of craftsmen's group, sort of castes, as wives and daughters, as well a well-known occurrence nowadays in the inland Niger Delta. Alexander Livingston-Smith suggested the same link for the spread of roulette and rouletting throughout the central part of Africa. If the latter assumption is taken into consideration, the arrival of those potters, so wife and daughters of somebody else, could have been used as proxy for dating the appearance of metalworking in Fezzan. Metal remains in the region only date as back as the mid-first millennium BC, with early evidence completely lacking, which means that unfortunately we cannot prove this assumption, but it is something that we have to keep in mind as a possibility. Ethnographic examples tell us that in family economies, such as that of the Sahara at the inception of the Garamantian era, kinship, friendship, and neighborly relations are the basic structuring forces behind knowledge circulation. Potting is a communal activity in which more than one person, usually women and children, are involved, and there is no specific moment at which the knowledge is transferred. We are not talking about industrial workshops here. Changing learning context leads to the reinterpretation of technological traditions and the adoption of new choices, which would become entangled with traditional ones, meaningful to a social level. If such changes happen within the household, like in our case, possible social tensions among actors would be better absorbed as part of a single and well-established system of interaction. If instead changes occurred because of the arrival of a new social group, which could be also the case here, perhaps a case, as we hypothesized, social tensions would probably need to be regulated at a higher level. And this would fit with the move towards increasing socio-political complexity that was underway in Fezzan at that time. The end of the second millennium marked a climatic crisis that must be viewed as the apex of the trend toward aridity that already started at the beginning of the fourth millennium BC. In the Sahara, an oasis-dotted landscape developed, which changed completely the lifestyle of local pastoral nomadic populations. Some settled more permanently in confined settings, the oasis. Others retained their pastoral nomadic lifestyle, but engaged in seasonal movements involving larger areas and longer and more random routes, becoming fundamental in expanding the supraregional sphere of cultural contact. The premises for technological encounter and transfer are thus set in place. And as already suggested, the space of experience could have been temporally and geographically different from the Fezzan of the early first millennium BC. To conclude, let me stress again that there is much scope for further research on the trans-Saharan handmade pottery. A future agenda should include a detailed reassessment of Garamantian ceramics in order to establish their complete set of technological features, particularly as far as shaping techniques are concerned, and secure chronology for the first roulette and painted decorations. A detailed analysis of prehistoric Saharan ceramics is also needed for a better understanding of the changes encountered in the Saharan Garamantian corpus, and of course, that of contemporary repertoires from sub-Saharan and Mediterranean Africa, so as to provide a solid framework for the many research questions we want to address. The political instability of most of the North African countries hampers our chance of obtaining fresh data from well-dated contexts at any time soon. And unfortunately, the pandemic doesn't help either. For the time being, we shall focus on already existing collections, starting by applying novel and cohesive methodology and terminology across the diverse panorama of ceramic studies in Africa. And this is something that, you know, we need to really start doing also within the Society for Libyan Study that has been so fundamental important for this kind of research in the Central Sahara. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Well, thank you very much, Maria, for such an excellent, detailed overview of Garamantian pottery, production techniques that were associated with this pottery, and as well as the broader implications that the study of pottery has. So there is now time for questions. If anyone has a question, please type it in the Q&A box, and then I will read it to Maria and she will answer it. I'd like to start. So you said that there is evidence of Roman pottery among the Garamantes, but that this Roman pottery was not imitated into any of the local forms. So my first question is, the Roman pottery we do find, is it just Roman fineware, or have we got a broader selection of pottery? And the fact that it was not imitated locally, what implications does this have? Is it because it was pottery just used by a very limited group of Garamantes, just the elites, and then the rest of the population sort of rejected it and was more interested in the local productions, as we can see someplace else? Or what's your view in general about this issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not a specialist of Roman pottery. There are other colleagues who are, but I can tell you that, first of all, there is more Roman pottery evidence in the Wadi al-Ajal, and of course in the capital Kerma and the cemeteries around, than in the Tanzzuft. So there is already a difference in geographical spatial distribution, let's say, or also chronological distribution. In the Wadi al-Ajal and in Germa, the Roman pottery is, there is fineware, but most of it is amphora from transportation. So clearly they are imports. So they were not produced in the Fezzana, they were imports from the north. And clearly they were used for specific functions and by specific people, indeed. And the fact that we have more in the capital and in the Wadi al-Ajal and less in the Tanzzuft is also, you know, self-explanatory in this sense. Probably the elite or the people more related to trade were using this kind of pottery. However, this pottery was there. And in a way, it becomes part of the Garamantian material culture, because it is not just, you know, imported and then disused, but it was reused. So as offering, a funerary offering in tombs, for instance, or we found also in the citadel of Agram Nadarif, many of these remains of amphora remains. So they reused the pottery. It became, so it was in a way reconceptualized within the Garamantian culture, but they never tried to copy it. So they never had this idea of, you know, let's make something similar. We have evidence from the Nile valleys, for instance, when pottery were mixed up between, for instance, Nubian and Egyptian pottery. And so you can see, you know, Egyptian pottery with Nubian decorations at different times. So there is some exchange, you know, in this sense. This never happened between the Roman pottery and the local Garamantian pottery. So clearly is a choice, is a cultural choice. Yeah. So I can use the Roman pottery. I have no problem in doing this. I can also use it because, you know, it's fancy and, you know, it's very nice to have it in my tomb or whatever, but I'm not going to do that kind of pottery. I'm not going to create something, you know, an hybrid or something more. And this is very interesting. So this is something that, because when we say, oh, there may be connection with the north, with the painted Berber-like ware, it seems that there are, you know, as for this kind of material culture, two different parallel layers. So the elite, or let's say the elite layers, and so the trade with Roman centers and Roman material culture, and then let's say the bottom, the down layer with the handmade pottery, and so probably with the local, let's say, communities have a different kind of interaction. So this is something that would be nice to study further, because indeed, I mean, it has never been addressed consistently.
Yeah. And speaking of connections with the North, we've got two questions which are actually related to each other, respectively by David Stone and Lisa Fentress. So they say, thank you very much for this interesting study of Garamantian pottery. At a small number of sites on the island of Jerba in Tunisia, Sami Ben Tahar and others have recently discovered the pottery called basketware that is dated to the early first millennium BCE. So do you see any connections between Garamantian and Saharan pottery and this type of basketware? Is there a shared practice of the rouletting technique? And then Lisa Fentress, building upon this question, mentions the discovery of corded ware in the 8th century BC from the same context. So, yeah.
I'm aware of this basketware because I'm in contact with one of these colleagues working in Tunisia, and it's interesting because not everything that is dotted on the surface is made with the same technique and tool and implement, and also depends on the kind of forms, the shape that we have. For instance, in the Garamantian pottery, particularly in the very late context, we have plates, so the so-called dokas, very flat plates. The bottom part is actually matte impressed, and that's made on purpose because it was used, as technical properties when you cook. So you use that as a plate for cooking, a pan, and that kind of matte impression is very functional for the temperature, so to don't break the pot. That's is matte impressed, which also, you can also say that is basket impressed. So it's the same kind of technique. There is not roulette or rocker stamp. So these are different techniques. So I can see some connections here, possible connections, again, possible avenues of connections that are not been, properly investigated for the time being. So I absolutely agree with both of you. There is scope for much more investigation in this sense, because this this basketware is not, or at least what I have seen so far, doesn't seem to be roulette decoration. It may be matte impressed. So this other technique that is also known from the Garamantian assemblage, but in later times. And this is also very important because we have some shift in time. So connections and directionality can change through time, so be from different places.
Yeah, so hopefully, I mean, as more of these pottery assemblages are being published, then the more information we can get for further study and a better understanding of these issues. We now have a question from Mohammed Abdullah, who says, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. So he has a question on whether any of these ware of any phase was ever found further to the east of the Sahara, such as Egypt or Sudan, for instance.
No. As I said, the easternmost evidence of this possible roulette decorated pots is from Borku, so from Chad, northern Chad, northwestern Chad, northeastern Chad. Nothing beyond that. In the Nile Valley, in the Greater Nile Valley, generally speaking, or Eastern Sahara, in later times, so actually from the second millennium on, we have matte impressed pottery in Nubia. So handmade matte impressed pottery, particularly on the bottom part of the vessel, was matte impressed. but it's not roulette, it's matte impressions. So it seems that there is a difference in technology, so that these two are not overlapping, at least for the time being, for what we know.
Right, it's very interesting. Next question from Anissa Malvoisin. Thank you for the fabulous lecture, and she uses your research in her thesis. She says, I really like the theoretical models of technological transfer for the use of grog and roulette decoration that you mentioned. And I was wondering if you might know why wheel throwing was never adopted by Garamantian potters.
That's a good question. We don't know. I mean, we can try to guess, but we don't know for sure. It's quite, interesting, because there is a direct connection between the Central Sahara, the Garamantes, and Roman Africa. Clearly, the people were moving back and forth, so not just objects, but also people. There may have been reasons and moments of encounter between potters, or anyway. But apparently this kind of transfer was not made. There are other transfers that were made, so other technological transfers. Think of, I don't know, agriculture and all the technologies from agriculture coming from the East, or other kind of, let's say, technologies. This one in particular never happened. Never happened. Yeah. So it's really interesting, and we should do more, on this aspect.
Yeah. And I would say there is another question by Philip Kenrick, which is related to this issue, and also what we were saying at the beginning about the lack of imitation of Roman pottery. So Philip asks, is this the case that the Garamantes did not discover the use of the fast wheel and were therefore unable to imitate effectively Roman imports, however much they may have admired them?
Yeah, they definitely didn't know about this. But as I said, I mean, there are other technologies that were transferred from the north. And so the fact that this one has not been transferred at all, it can be a choice. It can be a cultural choice. In a way, it's the same between Nubia and Egypt for the Nile Valley, for instance. Nubia pottery was always handmade. And although they were clearly in contact with Egypt and were consistently using Egyptian pottery, but for many, many centuries, they never made wheel-made pottery. So that, again, it's a choice. And again, we should trying to track this kind of choice. Why? The reason why.
Next question is from Robert Morcott. Thank you very much for the lecture. As someone dealing with the Nile Valley, especially Nubia and Sudan, I would be interested to know more about our current understanding of sub-Saharan Africa further west in the second and first millennia BCE. So you showed material from Niger and Mali. So how much do we know about the archaeology of those regions and the interactions?
Our knowledge is quite patchy. So there are many, many, many gaps.
It often happens.
Yes, and it's difficult also to go there and do new archaeological research, so to improve our knowledge. However, the Trans-Sahara project of University of Leicester was very, very much useful in this sense, because the project put together, when there were these conferences in 2014 and 15, people from different places across the Sahara and also at the outskirts of the Sahara. And we could interact and talk, so relate together and discuss this kind of information. And I have also, been also interested in Nile Valley archaeology, trying to relate and see how far west this kind of roulette technology would go, but also trying to check if anything was coming from the East. And as a matter of fact, as I said, I mean, we don't have evidence so far of roulette decoration going as eastern than, let's say, Chad in the Sahara. For the sub-Saharan Africa, so for the Sahel, is something different because, of course, it went, moved farther east. But for the Sahara, there is nothing farther than the Borku at the moment, at least. But if I see, let's say, the what happened in the Nile Valley, so if I try to track elements, characteristic elements of the pottery from the Nile Valley, and when I say the Nile Valley, it's mainly Nubia, I can find elements of the Nubian ceramic tradition, like, for instance, decoration that are triangles, small triangles put together. So, and usually they are at the rim top of rim band. This kind of decoration that is quite peculiar can be found, go from Nubia, move south along the Nile Valley, then along the, let's say, the eastern part, let's say, of the Nile Valley towards Chad. And we have evidence in the Chad, the cultures of the first millennium before and after in Chad of this kind of decoration. It actually goes also farther south in Kenya. But I could find few examples also in Fezzan, in Libya, of this kind of decoration. So to me, the idea is that there is one movement with the roulette, for instance, going from west to east, but there is also another movement going from east to west that is less known, but is there. So, but yeah, there is nothing going, let's say, for the Sahara, for the Central Sahara, going west. So the roulette technique seems something that came into the Sahara with the Garamantes, but after the Garamantes disappears. So with the mid-first millennium AD or late first millennium AD, it disappears. So it doesn't continue as a tradition in the Sahara.
Ahmed Bouzayan is asking about any potential connection between the handmade pottery of Fezzan and the one that was found in Cyrenaica. And the one in Cyrenaica is characterized by shell temper.
For the time being, no. As far as I know, we have no shell-tempered pottery either in the Wadi al-Ajal or in the Tanzzuft. And in both cases, we have archaeometric analysis. So if there were, shell tempered wares, we would have seen that. So no, for the time being, no.
Great. A question from Peter Kotros. Thanks for the interesting talk. You mentioned possible connections with Kate Manning's work in the Tilemsi, and she also mentioned some possible connections of Tilemsi with Charles Tichit in Mauritania. So do you see any possible stylistic similarities between Charles Tichit and your own work?
Not straightforward, but yes, there are, because they too are using this kind of globular colored jars. They have the grog, they use the rouletting. The problem is understanding the directionality, so from where they go from. So at the moment, it seems that the Tilemsi evidence is the earliest and then moved also west. So not just north, let's say, but also west. But yeah, everything can, needs further investigation, because again, we are not so, we still have too many gaps and too many biases in the data. And this was, for instance, one of the major problems in for our workshop in Leicester in 2015, because we can see, we have the feeling, we can see, pieces here and there, but we are missing the complete picture. the problem is how to go and get the complete picture, because we should go and retrieve collections from good contexts from different Saharan countries, and which is not really easy for different reasons, and then study them in a consistent way. So terminology, methodology has to be, you know, consistently applied, because otherwise we talk in different ways and with different languages. We don't understand each other. So the fact that I could manage to see that there was, and to describe that there was roulette decoration, is just because my perspective, my approach was an African approach, using methodologies that were used for the African, let's say, ceramics. And this made possible to connect the Garamantian material with sub-Saharan Africa. Otherwise, would have been if I would have approached, you know, the study from a different perspective, that would have been visible. So we will never know that there were this kind of decoration. So,
I mean, of course, obviously, it's always very important when people talk to each other, and people who come from different disciplines can share their data and their approaches. I think that applies pretty well to every area of archaeological research.
Yes, indeed.
Right, so I think we can conclude with one last question, quite a long question and statement from David Mattingly, so obviously a specialist of the area, who's talking about possibility for this transfer of technologies and how we can approach the issue. So first of all, thank you very much for such a great survey of this amazing material. With regard to the debate about the possible transference of pottery technology during the Garamantian era within the Sahara, David still thinks that maybe more consideration should be given to the idea that forced migration through the practice of slave taking may have played a part in this system. So the idea that slaves never get a chance to replicate aspects of their traditional culture is demonstrably not true. But even if this was the case, we should also take into account the fact that some women initially traded into the Garamantian lands may have quickly become integrated into the local Garamantian society through marriage, being married. So again, a practice for which there is evidence in other slave societies. So in any event, we do know that the Garamantes were involved in slaving. So the movement of people between Saharan and sub-Saharan regions at this time seems incontrovertible. So that seems a better place to start this investigation rather than saying we don't know how the technology moved. So
I agree with David. I mean, at the end of the day, what is important is that we clearly have evidence of this kind of movements, of people that moved, not just objects.
Yeah, exactly.
Clearly. So maybe we don't know how and why they moved, but they clearly moved, and they moved in a consistent way for a long time. So much to impact, let's say, the society of the Central Sahara, not just the material culture, but the society in general. So this is pretty clear. So what the handmade pottery tell us is a story that usually is under recognized, because we are focusing mainly on imports, fancy stuff from Roman Africa. So we are attracted more of this kind of interaction, no?
Which was a minority.
Which, as a matter of fact, yes. But which is one side of the story that is very important anyway. So, but this is a different side of the story, and which is also important to tell. And that's why I'm saying that also the connection with North Africa could go beyond our current understanding if we look at the handmade pottery also in context of Mediterranean Africa.
Yeah.
from the first millennium, you know, before Christ, so pre-Numidian and so on, early Numidian and so on. That would make, you know, enhance our understanding greatly in this sense. So a different kind of interaction that we now don't see very much.
Sure. Okay, so I think time's up. And I'd just like to thank you again, Maria, for such an interesting lecture, really, such an important assemblage of materials, and also for a very engaging discussion and very good, thought-provoking questions from the audience, and very, very good interaction.
Thank you very much to all of you again. Thank you for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Nicola. Thanks,
bye.
Maria.
Bye.
All right, I'm going to close it now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.